Uh, the Berlin Codex was found in a market in 1896 by a fella named Karl Reinhardt. Uh, he he simply bought this book, and so technically the first copy that we had of this Apocryphon of John was found in 1896. It wasn't published until the 1950s. So the ones in Nag Hammadi that were found in 1945 were actually the first ones to come to light. But there is a fourth copy of these. And so we actually have four different versions of this thing. In the Berlin Codex, there's a long version, and in the Nag Hammadi books, 2 has a short version, 4 has a short version, and 3 has a long version. So there's a long version and a short version. The difference between the long version and the short version are 2 different stories, 2 different sections that appear in the long version. One about Adam being created by demons and the process of Adam being created by these demons. And then there's a section that describes the visit or the coming of to earth of the providence of God. And the providence of God is not the providence of God. It's an entity. It's what we would probably classify as an angel. The providence of God. So that's the difference between the long version and the short version. And then there are differences when you have 4 texts. And we talked about this with the Didache. Since we only have one, we don't have corruptions. We don't have differences to worry about with the Didache because there's only one. But this time we have 4, and when you have 4, there are going to be differences between them besides just this long and short thing. One thing that's very interesting about the Apocryphon of John, all those other books in the Nag Hammadi texts and in the Berlin Codex were written originally in Coptic. Remember, I talked about that Coptic last week. Coptic is the Egyptian language, but it was written down. It was written in Greek letters, but it's the Egyptian language. And the others were written in Coptic originally. And even though the Apocryphon of John, all 4 of these Apocryphon of John copies are written down in Coptic, but they were originally it was originally a Greek text. So it was copied from Greek to Coptic. And we know this because there are a lot of Greek words in the Apocryphon of John that were never translated into Coptic. So you can tell that it had a lot of Greek. It came from a Greek text. It still had a lot of Greek in it. So it's fairly certain that it was originally in a Greek text, which makes sense because of how big a coverage it had in Christianity, how much it was known in Christianity. And the other thing it demonstrates something about this is in all 3 of these books that were found in Nag Hammadi, it's in books with other texts, several other texts, but it's always the first book in the book. And so what does that tell you? That it held a place of prominence. And that's because of what it does. I mean, I told you last week it's a mini Bible. So it kind of tells the whole story from beginning to end and goes into detail about creation and that sort of thing. So it was the book that kind of set up everything else for them. So it was always in the front. So those are some interesting things to keep in mind as we go through this. Now, another angle that I want you to know about, and we'll talk about this one several times as we go through it, is that of Irenaeus. Irenaeus was one of the church fathers, one of the most important church fathers. He wrote many things. You see his dates here. And we knew, we've always known about the Apocryphon of John, going all the way back. But we didn't have a copy of the Apocryphon of John until 1896 and 1945. So how did we know anything about the Apocryphon of John? It's because of, very specifically, Irenaeus and other church fathers. But Irenaeus was the big one. He wrote something, and a lot of the church fathers wrote these against heresies. And so they would go through and they would describe all the heresies that were out there, and then they would tell you what was wrong with them. And so he wrote one of these. His was a very large one and a very important one. And when the Greek title of the book is On the Detection and Overthrow of the So-Called Gnosis. So this whole thing was pretty much against Gnostic sects. And so the way that we know about a lot of the Gnostic writings that we never ever found a copy of is where the church fathers would include sections of it in their writings for their criticism of the Gnostics or any of the other heretic groups. And Irenaeus had a fairly large section on the Apocryphon of John, and we know that this was written around 180. So we know that the Apocryphon of John was already there before that. So chapter 29 or 30, depending on whose translation you look at, it's one or the other, is the title of that chapter is Doctrines of the Ophites and the Sethians. Specifically, the group that we're talking about here with the Apocryphon of John are typically called the Sethians. We'll see why in just a second. So there's this whole section of Irenaeus talking about the Sethians and the teaching that's in the Apocryphon of John. He quotes large pieces of it. So that's all we know about them, is what we learn from Irenaeus until we actually have a whole copy of the Apocryphon of John to read ourselves. So what's dangerous about finding these things in the church fathers like this, and how does that cloud our understanding of what the Sethians believed? Think about it. If Russia, somebody from communist Russia back in the Cold War, and maybe even China now, were to describe life in the United States and what we believe, would it be exactly what we believe?
It's their perception of what we believe.
Yeah, and it would always take the negative approach. It would find all the things you could condemn about our society, and it would condemn them. So that's what you get with the church fathers when they're talking about the heretics. So you have to be aware that if you don't have a copy of the Apocryphon of John, and this is the person telling you what's in the Apocryphon of John and what's wrong with it, then you're probably missing some big chunks. And that's the case. That's always the case, in fact. That's why when you find these books on the piles of fire, that's why they're on the piles of fire, because they don't want you to see the stuff they don't tell you. So, not that there's anything positive that's missing here. I'm not trying to cast that kind of aspersion on this, but I just want you to kind of keep that in mind. Anytime we're talking about the stuff the church fathers said about something, you're only getting the bad side. You're not getting anything else. So, but the Apocryphon of John is so different from our comprehension of Christianity that it's not. I mean, there's not going to be any rehabilitation of the Apocryphon of John in this. But I do want you to kind of keep that in mind, because I'm going to go back to Irenaeus from time to time and say what he said about the Apocryphon of John as we go through the Apocryphon of John. Okay? So just to get all that set up. This is the most quoted verse in Irenaeus's against heresies, and from 1 Corinthians 15:50. So he quotes Paul saying, "I tell you this, brothers, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable." And one reason that he quotes this one so much is because this is one that the Gnostics really liked. Can you see why? Can anybody tell me why that's the case?
Spirit versus flesh. Yeah.
Right.
Flesh.
Material, bad, spirit, good.
It seems like in the Apocryphon of John that, like you said, it's first. Well, it's like our Genesis story is of the material world. Their Genesis story is of the creation of heaven and gods and all that.
Yep.
That's why it's the first.
Yep.
It's
There's
the Genesis of
right.
the spirit world.
And that's what you're going to see, pretty much off the bat is when we read the book of Genesis, it gets to us really fast. Create the world as fast as you can and then put a man in it so we can talk about men. The Apocryphon of John isn't like that. The Apocryphon of John wants to tell you all the good stuff that happened before there were people. So you'll see that as we get into it. All right, so this whole notion of material being bad and spirit being good, you can read this verse two different ways. And that's why Irenaeus kept going back to it, was to point out that Paul didn't mean that there was a material body and a separate spirit from that body, and the only thing important about it was the spirit, and that was all that was going to survive. There wouldn't be a body. And if you and we're going to probably read chapter 15 or big parts of it at some point. And if you take this verse out of context, you can say that Paul believed that there was material that had to be gotten rid of and only have spirit left when you die, when you go to heaven, so to speak. That was the case. That was what the point was. But if you read the whole chapter, clearly that's not what Paul was saying. So this is a theological approach that has been used for centuries, and it still gets used a lot today. Pull out that one verse. Who cares about the context? And make your point. And that's how this was done. Okay, so we're talking about this one particular group, Sethians. And so, who were the Sethians? They had obvious characteristics. They considered them. They were called Sethians. There's no evidence that they called themselves Sethians, which is typically the way nicknames like this go on. But they did consider themselves to be the seed of Seth, the descendants of Seth, and that's why they were called the Sethians by the church fathers. Why? We'll talk about in just a second. So, at the foundation of what we're talking about here, what they believed and that sort of thing, they sought to weave the Platonic universe into Christianity. So I talked about Plato and his elemental theory, his theory of forms last week, and the whole cave analogy. Remember the cave analogy where what we see isn't what really is, and if you can just get out of the cave and see what really is, you have this special knowledge, and now you know what the world was really like. That's what they were trying to weave into Christianity, because they came from a belief of this, and they needed, if they were going to be Christians, they had to keep this at the same time they become Christians. So, that said, this seed of Seth and these people probably, or at least possibly, may have had a pre-Christian presence, may have existed before Christianity did. This is a kind of a common thing with Gnosticism. Gnosticism didn't begin with Christianity. Gnosticism existed before Christianity. Because really what Gnosticism is this notion that whatever the truth is, whether you're Jewish or Greek or whatever, you have to have this special knowledge. And so when Christianity comes along, you're going to get Gnostic Christians too. And so there's pretty good evidence that this whole notion of this group who became the Sethians existed before Christianity. Specifically, in in um, in a Jewish sect, a group of Jewish folks who believed these Platonic ideas, um, and were weaving it into Judaism. And then Christianity comes along, and Christianity is a much better target than Judaism for this. And so they kind of gravitated toward Christian Gnostic groups and kind of became predominant there. So they probably had some pre-Christian existence. They saw Jesus as the second Seth. So Jesus was the second divine Seth. Now, Paul did this same kind of thing. Can you give me the example I'm talking about with Paul?
He said that Jesus was the second
Adam. So Paul did this same thing with Adam. Jesus was the second Adam. You had the corrupt Adam, and Jesus is the divine, the good Adam, the right Adam, the true Adam, which has some. You have to. And this is the thing we lose in translation. That has some deeper idea other than just talking about the guy we call Adam. Because what is Adam? What is that? What's that name? It's the Hebrew word for man. So Jesus was the second divine man, not specifically just Adam. So Paul would have heard that in his head. All the people reading and all the people who came from the background of Judaism would have heard that in their head because they knew that. We lose that completely in translation. This is not the same thing because Seth, they were talking about Seth. Who is Seth? That was Adam and Eve's third son, and replaced. Who did he replace? So he was technically the second living son in that situation. So the contrast is Seth was the good guy, Cain was the bad guy. So you have that black and white analogy there, good and evil. So Seth's the good guy. Everybody is born as a son of Cain because what? They don't have what that they need? Special knowledge. Once you achieve that, you become a son of Seth. Okay, so that's the formula. That's how this works. So you have to be able to put all that together in your head to know where this is coming from. So that's the contrast. You want to become of the seed of Seth by getting the special knowledge, so you won't be the seed of Cain anymore. The whole nature of this Apocryphon of John is to help you find that. Salvation comes by learning the truth, getting out of the cave, in the Platonic cave analogy, about the divine spark that you have inside of you. Everybody is born with a tiny bit of God in them. Now, but when I say God, I'm not talking about Yahweh. We're talking about that one true, all universal God. And so once we get into the story, you'll be able to make all this out. And everybody gets born with a little piece of that, and there's a reason everybody gets born with a little piece of that, which you'll see. What you have to do is find out that you have that. You have to remember that you have it. That's the special knowledge. And once you remember that you have the spark in you, then the spark can do its job. So you had to learn that truth. Interestingly enough, though, that wasn't enough. You also had to be baptized. So there's the whole element of Christianity coming into this. So you got the Greek stuff, the Greek religion stuff, but you also end up with the Jewish Christian notion that you also have to be baptized, because when you're baptized, you receive these 5 seals on your life. You get sealed and protected from the evil. So both of those things had to occur. And then you also, once you became a Christian, you also had to live an ascetic life, meaning you couldn't enjoy anything. You were supposed to stay as close as you could to the non-material part of your world. The whole idea is to get rid of anything material. Anything physical is bad, no matter what it is. And so you need to try to stay away from it. And so that was the whole ascetic idea of this thing. All right, just to kind of warm you up, this is how it begins. And I'm sure I'm going to go back and there's going to be more background that's going to come into this besides just going through this. But I wanted you to kind of get a flavor of this as we start through it. So, the teaching of the Savior and the revelation of the mysteries and the things hidden in silence, even these things which he taught John his disciple. Now, when it says things which he taught John, he's not talking about while he was here before his resurrection. These are the things he taught John after his resurrection that we're about to learn about here. And here's the beginning of the story. And it happened one day when John, the brother of James, who are the sons of Zebedee, had come up to the temple, and this is after Jesus has died, after the resurrection, all of that. John comes up to the temple, that a Pharisee named Arminius approached him and said to him, "Where is your master whom you followed?" So you have this Pharisee. Now, in their mind, they won. The Pharisees won. They killed Jesus, he's gone. So that's the idea here. So this Pharisee comes up to him, kind of in a braggadocious way and says, "Where is this master that you used to have?" And so John answers and says to him, "He's gone to the place from which he came." And the Pharisee said to him, "With deception did this Nazarene deceive you, and he filled your ears with lies and closed your hearts and turned you from the traditions of your fathers." So that stuff that Jesus told you was not any good, he lied to you. He deceived you. So here's John being a regular, everyday Christian. Because how does he know that Jesus didn't lie to him? So he starts having questions. He starts having doubts. So this is what happens next. "When I, John, heard these things, I turned away from the temple to a desert place." He's got to go out and get away from everything so that he can get back to his center, get back to his faith. "And I grieved greatly in my heart, saying, How then was the Savior appointed? And why was he sent into the world by his Father? And who is his Father who sent him? And of what sort is that aeon to which we shall go? For what did he mean when he said to us, This aeon to which you go is a type of the imperishable aeon? And did he not teach us concerning the latter of what sort it is?" Okay, so this is already, you start to see this is a little bit different than what you're used to. And so these are the questions that John goes out into the wilderness and asks himself. But the main reason I wanted to get to this point is so you could see this word aeon. It's not a word you're probably that familiar with, but it is a typical word in a different kind of philosophy, Platonic philosophy. So Plato talked about the eons all the time. And these aeons were beings. They were somewhere between gods and angels. They're a little more than gods, something we might call demigods. And they were responsible for everything that came from the one God, the one true God. And so the question that he's asking here, you already see is not a typical Christian question. It's really looking at this more from a Greek perspective. So we're going to find out, these are the questions that are going to get answered in the Apocryphon of John. So as we go through these, you'll start to see who the eons are. So as we start to go through this, the story progresses from the Big Bang which is not what it talks about, but just to give you a point of reference, it progresses from nothing to something. That's where we're going to start, way before there are any people. All right? That's most of the point of this book. So we'll go from there next week.